The table is old. The wood has gone dark around the edges where hands have rested on it for years. I am sitting at it alone. The room is still. The sky outside the window is that deep gray blue that comes just before the sun decides to show up. Not quite morning, not quite night. The kind of hour where the world has not started yet and everything is quiet in a way that feels almost too heavy to carry. In my hand is a small silver pyx. If you do not know what that is, it is a tiny round container. Catholic, about as wide as my palm. The edges have been worn smooth from years of being held and carried and opened and closed. There are tiny scratches all across the surface. Some of them catch what little morning light is already slipping through the window. The lid has a cross engraved on it, small, simple, and without thinking about it, without even noticing that I am doing it, my thumb is moving slowly across that cross, back and forth, like I have been doing this for years, like my hand knows this shape better than it knows most things. I have been sitting here staring at this thing for several minutes before I finally look up. Before I tell you what happened, I need you to know something. I need to know that you are still here, because what I am about to share is the kind of thing a person does not say out loud easily, the kind of thing that costs something just to put into words. I have carried this for years, and I am ready to put it down now, but I need you to stay. Just stay. If this channel has ever given you something real, something that made you feel less alone, or made you think about your life in a way you were not expecting, then please stay, subscribe, be here for this one. Because this story does not belong only to me anymore. I think it belongs to you too. If you had met me 3 years ago, you would never believe this little silver container belonged to me. I need to explain how it became the reason my entire life fell apart. Let me take you back. Several years before that morning at the table, I was respected. That is the honest word for it. I was respected by a lot of people in my city, specifically in my Muslim community. I was a lecturer at the university, comparative religion. I had spent years studying what different faiths believed, how those beliefs developed, where they came from, and in my view, where they went wrong. Christians were my most frequent subject. Not because I hated them, I want to be clear about that. I never hated Christians personally. The people themselves, most of them, were decent people, sincere people, but I believed, deeply, that their theology had been corrupted over centuries. I believed the early followers of Jesus never worshipped him as God. I believed the church had invented that idea later, that it had grown slowly out of Greek philosophy and political pressure, that it had nothing to do with what Jesus himself ever claimed. I had the books, I had the historical sources, I had the arguments laid out cleanly, step by step, each one built carefully on the one before it. And I spent years teaching exactly that, refining it, making the argument sharper every time someone challenged it. My most specific target was the Eucharist. That is the Catholic belief that the bread and wine used during Mass actually become the body and blood of Jesus Christ, not symbolically. Not as a memorial, actually, physically. Catholics call it the real presence. The idea that the living Christ is truly present in that small white wafer the priest places on your tongue. To me, it was the clearest and most obvious example of how far Catholics had drifted from true monotheism. They were, in my understanding, worshipping bread, ordinary bread that a priest had said words over, and they had constructed an elaborate and ancient theology around it to justify doing so, to make it feel like something more than what it was. I said this in lectures. I said it in debates, I wrote about it in articles and in prepared talks that I gave at community events. I described the Eucharist as the central error of Catholic Christianity, the place where the whole system most clearly broke down. And I said it calmly, without anger, without drama. Just as a man stating a fact he had verified many times over. My reputation grew because of that confidence. Students would come to my lectures and leave, feeling like they understood something they had not understood before. Community leaders invited me to speak at gatherings and conferences. I was known as the man who could take apart Christian arguments methodically, leaving nothing standing, and do it without raising his voice. I took pride in that, genuine pride, the kind that settles into a person and becomes part of how they understand themselves. I was intelligent. I was disciplined. I believed I was impossible to deceive. Students admired me, communities invited me. I had everything I thought mattered. I never once imagined that I was standing on the edge of losing all of it. One afternoon, I walked into a Catholic church simply to observe. This was not unusual for me. I had done it before. It was research in a sense. Understanding the practice from the inside so I could describe it more accurately when I wrote or spoke about it. Seeing the ritual in person gave my arguments more texture, more detail. I could say I had been there, that I had seen it, that I was not speaking from a distance. I slipped into a pew near the back and settled in. Mass was already underway. The priest was at the altar. There was soft music somewhere ahead of me. The smell of incense was still drifting through the air from earlier in the service, something sweet and faintly smoky that clung to the old stone of the building. People sat quietly around me, following the movements of the liturgy with a familiarity that comes from doing something your whole life. I watched all of it and felt nothing except mild interest. Near the front pew, something small caught my attention for just a moment. An elderly man. White-haired, moving slowly between the rows of seated people. He wore a plain dark jacket. He carried something in his hand. He stopped beside someone who was seated and looked frail, perhaps unable to move easily, and he reached carefully into his jacket pocket and drew out a small silver container. He opened it with deliberate care. He removed something small and white and placed it gently into the person's open hand. Then he closed the container, slipped it quietly back into his pocket, and moved on. I registered what I had seen, an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion. I had read about this role, lay Catholics who are authorized to carry the Eucharist, especially to those who are sick or unable to make it to the front of the church. The silver container was a payex. I knew the word. I had read about it in the course of my research. I thought nothing of it beyond that. To me it was simply another piece of the ritual, another prop in a tradition I had already decided was built on a theological mistake. The man, the container, the careful way he moved between the pews, none of it meant anything to me. I left the church that afternoon and forgot about him completely before I reached the end of the block. A few weeks later I had an idea. I turned it over in my mind for a day or two before I brought it to anyone. I wanted it to be clear. I wanted it to be tight. When I shared it with 3 Muslim friends of mine, men who knew my work, who had sat in my lectures, who had watched my debates and agreed with my conclusions, I laid it out simply. We would attend Sunday Mass at a Catholic church. We would blend in with the congregation. We would participate in everything, including communion. We would receive the host, we would swallow it, and we would walk out of that church and prove by the simple fact of our continued existence, unchanged, unaffected, undestroyed, that what Catholics called the body of Christ was nothing more than a piece of bread. They agreed immediately. There was excitement in their faces when I explained it. The particular kind of excitement that comes from doing something that feels like proof of everything you already believe. We planned it for that Sunday. We dressed carefully that morning, not to stand out, but not sloppily either. Dark colors, clean clothes, shoes that looked appropriate for a church. We arrived a few minutes after Mass had already begun, so we would not have to navigate introductions or questions at the door. We found seats in the middle of the church, surrounded by ordinary Sunday worshippers, families with children sitting close together, older couples who knew all the words by heart, a few young people sitting alone. We did what everyone around us did. We stood when they stood. We sat when they sat. We kneeled when they kneeled, though none of us were used to that movement, and it felt stiff and awkward, our bodies not knowing the rhythm of it. When the people around us crossed themselves, we copied it. Fingers moving forehead to chest to shoulder, too slow, a half beat behind, but nobody looked at us. I was watching everything. That is what I do. I notice details. I observe. I filed away what the church looked like, what the people were wearing, the way the priest moved and spoke, the specific words used at different moments in the liturgy, everything I could use later when I described this from a lectern. When communion began, the lines formed naturally. People stood and moved toward the front of the church without any kind of announcement. It was something they had done so many times it happened on its own. We stood with them and joined the nearest line. I remember the way the line moved. slowly, steadily, the sound of footsteps on the stone floor. The soft music from somewhere near the front, the murmur of the priest's voice as he spoke the same words to each person ahead of me. The woman directly in front of me had gray hair pinned back precisely. She moved with the calm certainty of someone who has done this thousands of times. She received communion and walked back to her pew, and I stepped forward. The priest was perhaps 50 years old. Ordinary face, calm eyes. He looked at me the way he had looked at every person before me, without scrutiny, without suspicion, with the same unhurried attentiveness he had given everyone else. The body of Christ. I said Amen, the same quiet syllable I had heard everyone else use. He placed the host on my tongue. I let it sit there for a moment. It was thin, almost nothing. I was aware of the texture of it, dry and light. Then I swallowed it, the way I might swallow anything at all. Without thought, without ceremony, without the smallest trace of belief or reverence. We all four made it back to our pews. I did not look at my friends during the walk back. I kept my face forward, my expression the same as everyone else's, but I could feel the contained energy between us. The particular tension of people trying very hard not to react to something. Outside the church, we dropped the whole performance at once. We laughed. It started with one of my friends and it spread immediately. Not mean-spirited laughter, or at least that is what I told myself at the time. Just the easy laughter of people who had done something daring and walked away without consequence. I could feel the relief of it and the triumph mixed together. I spread my hands wide and said exactly what I had planned to say, the line I had been building toward since I first came up with the idea. See, nothing happened. My friends nodded. They were grinning. We stood there on the sidewalk in our neat clothes with the Sunday morning traffic drifting past, and we felt, all four of us, like we had just demonstrated something, like we had walked up to the claim and tested it and found it hollow, like we had done what needed to be done. I did not notice until we were already walking away that the same elderly man from weeks before was still near the church entrance. He was beside a woman in a wheelchair. He was closing that small silver pyx carefully with both hands. His movements were the same as before, deliberate and unhurried, like the closing of the container required his full attention. He did not look at us. He did not look up at all. We did not look at him. I forgot him again before we turned the corner. Weeks passed, and then we did it again. A different parish this time. Across the city, in a neighborhood none of us usually visited. Different architecture, different priest, different Sunday, but the same plan, the same neatly pressed clothes, the same careful observation of what everyone around us was doing so we could mirror it without drawing attention. We arrived in the middle of the opening hymn and found seats near the center, not too close to the front, not too far to the back. The church smelled different than the last one, less incense, more like candle wax and old wood. The congregation was smaller, more elderly. There was a quietness to the room that was different from the first church, less populated, more still. We went through the entire Mass the same way, standing, sitting, kneeling, crossing ourselves at the right moments. By now the movements felt slightly more familiar. We were less stiff about it. We had done this once before, and that once had made it easier. When communion came, we joined the line again. I received the host again, said Amen again, swallowed it again. The drive home was different from the first time. The relief and triumph feeling had already been used. This time, what was in the car was more relaxed, more comfortable, like something you have done twice starts to feel like something you know how to do. One of my friends started talking before we even reached the main road. He said the most remarkable thing about all of this was that somewhere in that church, a priest genuinely believed he had just fed the body of God to 4 Muslim men. That the holiest act of Catholic worship had just been performed on people who rejected its entire foundation. He thought this was the funniest thing he had ever considered. He said without knowing it, Catholics were doing dawah in reverse, giving their God to the very people who said he was not God at all. We all laughed. It built on itself the way laughter does when everyone in a space is in exactly the same mood, each person's reaction feeding the next person's until the whole car is loud with it. The jokes kept coming, elaborate, clever jokes built on top of each other, each one sharper than the last. I drove and laughed and felt completely certain that I was right. I remember that feeling precisely, the comfort of certainty, the warmth of it, the way it makes the world feel like it has a clear shape that you understand and everyone else is still figuring out. I almost did not register as we had been filing past the back of the church near the end of Mass, the flash of silver near the side pews, the elderly man again, different church, same man, moving quietly through the congregation with that same careful, purposeful walk, holding the pyx, closing it, sliding it back into his pocket. I noticed it for a half second, then I let it go. More weeks passed, then months. The confidence between us had become something close to a game by that point. We expanded it. Rather than returning to the same parish again and again, we began choosing different churches each weekend. A larger cathedral on one Sunday, a small neighborhood parish the next. We kept a loose mental list of which ones we had visited. We planned it over meals and laughed about it between bites. Receiving communion had become routine. I am uncomfortable saying that word now, routine, because the truth is, that is exactly what it became. Something that had started as a bold act of argument had turned into something we did without much deliberation. We would mention it on a Thursday or Friday, agree on which church to try that weekend, show up on Sunday morning and move through the steps with the ease of people who have done it enough times to stop thinking about the individual pieces of it. One Sunday I was walking back from the communion line to my seat and I was almost back when an elderly woman turned from the pew beside mine and looked at me. She smiled. Not a polite smile, not the kind of smile you give a stranger out of obligation, a wide, genuinely warm smile, the kind that comes from a person who is actually glad. She thought I was another believer. She thought I was someone who had just shared in what she shared in. She thought we were connected by this thing that mattered deeply to her. The warmth of that smile landed on me like a small, unexpected weight. Something moved in me, just for a second. Just at the edge of a thought, the word wrong came and went so quickly I almost did not catch it. Not theological wrong, not the kind of wrong I usually thought about. Something else, something simpler. She had just offered me her genuine gladness, the warmth of believing she was surrounded by people who shared her faith, and I had accepted it under false pretenses. I had let her smile at me like a fellow believer when I was there specifically to demonstrate that what she believed was a mistake. I buried it. I sat down and I buried that uncomfortable moment underneath everything else I believed, every argument I had built, every lecture I had given, every reason I had for being there. The weight of all of that was much heavier than one old woman's smile. We filed out near the end of Mass, and I saw the silver pyx again near the exit. The same man. Different church, same unhurried movement, same careful closing of the lid, same way of slipping it back into his jacket pocket, like it was something he had been doing his whole life without making a ceremony of it. I saw it and I walked past it. Holy Thursday, that was my idea. I had read specifically about Holy Thursday, the Mass of the Lord's Supper, Catholics call it, the evening liturgy that begins the 3 holiest days of the Catholic year. The night they remember the Last Supper. According to Catholic belief, the night Jesus himself first said the words over bread and wine that Catholics have been repeating ever since. The night the Eucharist began. If we were going to prove that the host was nothing more than bread, I thought, what better setting than the night Catholics themselves say it all started? We arrived to find the church full, more people than any of the other masses we had attended, families filling the rows from front to back. There were flowers near the altar, candles along the sides of the nave. The evening light came through the high windows at a low angle and fell in long strips across the stone floor. But it was the atmosphere that was different from anything I had experienced in any of the other churches on any of the other Sundays. The room was quiet, heavily quiet, not the usual pre-mass quiet of people settling in and waiting for things to begin, something else. The people sitting around us were still in a way that was different from ordinary stillness, like they were holding something carefully, like they were aware of something that required them to be present in a way that an ordinary Sunday did not. I told myself it was theater. I told myself this was exactly how religious traditions worked, that the atmosphere was constructed to produce the feeling of significance, that the candles and the silence and the full church were all part of a system designed to make ordinary things feel extraordinary. I understood the mechanics of it, I told myself. Understanding the mechanics meant you could not be taken in by them. We found seats. We moved through the liturgy. We had done this enough times by now that the standing and sitting and kneeling came automatically, our bodies falling into the rhythm without needing to think about it. When communion began, we joined the line. I walked forward the way I had walked forward every other time, the same measured pace, the same expression. The priest placed the host on my tongue and I said Amen, and turned back toward my seat, and I remember noticing the faces of the people around me, not because anything struck me exactly, but there was something in the faces, an openness, a seriousness, like people who are somewhere that matters to them and they know it. We returned to our seats and stayed through the rest of the service. When it ended, we moved with the crowd toward the doors and stepped out into the night air. The street was cool. Cars were parked along both sides. A few people were saying quiet goodbyes near the steps. And then one of my friends stepped away from the group a little, turned to face us, spread his arms wide, and said it loudly enough that people around us could still hear him. If this really was God, he would have stopped us. He grinned. Everyone laughed. Less than 10 minutes later, he was on the ground. I was still close to him when it happened. I heard nothing. There was no sound before it. No stumble, no sudden breath, no hand reaching for a wall or a railing. His legs simply stopped working and he went down. He was sitting on the pavement looking up at the rest of us with an expression I had never seen on his face in all the years I had known him. Confusion, fear, something beneath both of those that I did not have a word for. He could not get up on his own. We got him to a hospital that night. They ran tests. They looked at his back, his spine, the nerves running down through his legs. They found nothing. No injury that the scans could show, no neurological event they had a name for. He was not in pain. He simply could not walk normally. His legs had stopped doing what legs are supposed to do, and nobody in that hospital could tell us why. I stood in the waiting room that night and I built the word coincidence very deliberately inside my mind, and I planted it there, and I stood next to it and refused to move. It was a coincidence. I said it to myself clearly. I said it more than once. I went home that night and I still believed it. Several days after Holy Thursday, I was walking through my office at the university, moving between classes, crossing the room to reach something on my desk. The silver pyx was sitting there. On the surface of my desk, in the open, just sitting there as if someone had set it down and forgotten it. I stopped walking and stood looking at it. Small, round, the worn silver surface, the cross on the lid. My first thought was that someone from one of the churches had tracked me down. That somehow at one of those masses we had been recognized and this was a message of some kind. My second thought was a student, someone who knew my work and thought it would be funny to leave a prop from the exact religion I spent my time critiquing sitting on my desk. I asked my colleagues one by one. I asked the department assistant who sat near the door and noticed everyone who came and went. I sent messages to a few students who might plausibly be behind something like this. Nobody knew anything about it. Nobody had seen anyone come into my office. Nobody had left it there as a joke. Nobody had any idea where it had come from. I picked it up and held it. It felt the same as it had looked from a distance. Small, heavier than you expected for its size. The lid moved smoothly on its hinge. I opened it. Empty. I closed it again. I went back to the Catholic church I had visited most recently. I went on a weekday afternoon when it was quiet. I found a priest and I explained that I had found this container and believed it belonged to the parish. He looked at it briefly and thanked me with the straightforward politeness of someone who is used to handling small logistical matters. I handed it to him. He took it. I left. I told myself that was the end of it. A strange couple of days, something with an explanation I had not found yet, but that certainly existed. I went back to my work. I did not think about it much more than that. 1 week later, I opened my desk drawer to find a pen. The pyx was inside the drawer. I sat back in my chair slowly. I sat there and looked at it for a long moment without touching it. The drawer was open, and the pyx was resting among the ordinary objects of my working life. Pens, a phone charger, a small notebook, and the silver pyx closed, cross-facing up. I was certain I had returned it. I was not misremembering. I had gone to the church on a specific afternoon. I had found the priest. I had placed the pyx in his hands. I had watched him take it. That had happened. The memory of it was clear and specific and real. I picked the pyx up slowly. It was the same one, the same scratches, the same worn edges, the same faint cross on the lid. I told my friends. I told one of them in particular, the one who liked to solve problems, who was good at finding the angle that explained things. He suggested someone was pranking me, a student maybe, or a colleague who had access to my office and thought it would be amusing. He pointed out that I was known as the person who criticized Catholic practice. What better joke than leaving a Catholic object on the desk of the Catholic critic? He made it sound obvious and comfortable, and I held on to his explanation the way you hold on to something when you are standing somewhere that feels unsteady. I set the pyx back on my desk and went back to my work. I slept badly that night, and the night after. The third time was different. I had traveled to another city for an academic conference. 2 days, 1 night. I packed my own bag. I knew what was in it because I had packed it myself, and I had opened it in the hotel room that evening to get what I needed for the night, and the bag had contained only what I put in it. I came home. I dropped the bag just inside my apartment door. I carried it to the kitchen counter and began unpacking it. Clothes that needed washing, toiletries in their small bottles, a book I had brought but never opened, and at the bottom, sitting alone in the corner of the bag, touching none of my other belongings, not wrapped in anything, not tucked inside anything, just resting there as if it had always been there. The pyx. I set it on the counter. I did not pick it up immediately. I just stood there looking at it in the afternoon light coming through my kitchen window. My bag, my city, my apartment, and that small silver container that I had returned to a priest's hands and watched be taken. There was no explanation I could build that held. Not a prank, not a mix-up, not a coincidence. I had been in another city. I had packed the bag myself. I had opened it myself in a hotel room where no one had access to it, and it had not been in the bag at that time. I stood at my counter, and for the first time in my life, in my actual life, not as a theoretical exercise, not as something I was considering in an argument, something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a hairline fracture in the floor of my certainty. The thing I had built my entire identity on, the absolute confidence that I knew what was real and what was not, that I could not be deceived, that I had the framework to explain anything that needed explaining. That floor developed a crack. Just one, just small, but I felt it. And I noticed only later that I had started doing something without deciding to. Everywhere I went now I checked. A quick glance at a desk, a table, a counter. Instinctive, like checking for your keys or your phone. I was looking for the pyx wherever I arrived. I had not made a conscious decision to do it. I just was. I noticed I was doing it before I could make myself stop. I went back through everything in my memory, not with notes or a written timeline, just alone in my apartment at night, sitting with the quiet, going back through every church, every mass, every communion line, every drive home, every joke, every moment of comfortable certainty. And in every single memory, somewhere at the edge of it, the elderly man was there. At the first church where I had observed Mass before any of this began, he had been near the front pew, closing the pyx carefully after giving communion to someone who could not walk to the front. At the first church where we had received communion ourselves, I had barely glanced at him on the way out, but he had been near the entrance, the pyx in his hands. At the second parish, I had almost not registered him, but the memory was there now that I looked for it. Somewhere near the back, moving between the rows, at the different churches during those months of weekends, I could not place him at all of them, but at more than one, yes, always the same movement, always the same careful closing of the small silver container. At Holy Thursday, near the side aisle, the pyx in his hands, closing it with that same unhurried care. Every single time, not always visible, not always obvious, but there, at the edge of my vision, in the background of memories I had stored without knowing I was storing them. I still could not call it supernatural. I am not someone who makes that leap easily. My entire career had been built on holding things at a distance and finding the rational explanation, the angle, the mechanism, the piece of information that made the strange thing ordinary again. But I could not find that piece this time. And that absence, that gap where the explanation was supposed to be, had begun to feel enormous. Months after Holy Thursday, my friend was still not walking normally. He could move, slowly, with effort, the kind of walking that looks like work and exhaustion in every step. The doctors had found nothing to treat because they had found nothing to explain. He had learned to manage around it. He did not talk about it often. I did not ask about it often. We did not talk about Holy Thursday. We did not talk about what any of us had been doing in those communion lines. The subject had gone silent between all of us without anyone deciding to silence it. Another member of our group was not sleeping. He had mentioned nightmares more than once. The same images coming back every night, he said, without giving the details. He had gotten quieter over the months. Less present in conversation, somewhere just behind his own eyes. The friendships were dissolving, not with a fight, not with a decisive break, just the slow drift that happens when people share something they cannot look at directly, and so they stop wanting to be in the same room where they might have to look at it. I was alone more and more. Late one night I sat in my apartment and I had nothing around me. I had not planned it that way. I had simply stopped reaching for things. The phone was not in my hand. No book was open on the table. No argument was in progress on a page in front of me. Just the room. Just the silence. The silver pyx was on the table beside me. I did not remember placing it there. It had been somewhere in the apartment. A drawer, the counter. I was not keeping careful track of it anymore. It was simply there now, on the table, in the circle of lamplight. I sat across from it for almost a full hour. Just looking at it, just letting it be there, my hands flat on the table, my breathing slow, all the arguments I had spent years building sitting quiet somewhere behind my eyes, like books on a shelf nobody was reading. The pyx just sat there, small, worn, the cross on the lid catching the lamplight. Finally, I reached across the table. I picked it up. I opened it. The lid moved the way it always moved, smoothly, no resistance. A small round interior, and nothing inside it. Empty, ordinary. I held it open in my hand and looked at it. The room was silent, exactly as it had been. The lamp, the window with the dark street outside, the familiar shapes of everything I owned, arranged exactly where I had left them. Nothing happened. I waited, though I could not have told you what I was waiting for. A thought formed that this had all been exactly what I said it was. Coincidence and strangeness that had no real meaning behind it. I almost closed the lid. My thumb moved toward the edge of it, and then the silence changed. I need you to sit with that sentence for a moment, because I am not sure I can explain it better than that. The silence did not end. Nothing made a sound. But the silence itself became something different, the way a room feels different when someone walks into it even before you turn around. The quality of the quiet shifted. It became heavier, fuller, like something had weight that had not had weight before. My heartbeat slowed. That was the first thing my body noticed. Not my mind, my body, my pulse, which had been quick and tight all evening, went slow. Not the slow of someone who has relaxed, the slow of something being held carefully from outside, like a hand placed gently on something moving fast to bring it to a stop. I became aware of the air in the room. The way it felt against my skin, heavier than before, not pressing, just present. The way air feels before a storm, charged with something that has not happened yet. I was not alone. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I have said it to very few people, and I know what it sounds like. I saw no figure. No light that was not already there. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared. But the awareness that I was not alone in that room came so completely and so clearly that doubting it would have felt like doubting the floor under my feet. It was simply there, the most certain thing in the room, a presence, and I was not afraid of it. That surprised me more than anything else. I am not a person who frightens easily, but I would have expected fear. I would have expected my body to react with fear to something it could not name and could not see. Instead, my body went still, not frozen, still. The way still is different from frozen. Frozen is stuck. Still is settled. Like something in me had been looking for this place to land for a very long time. The armor was gone. That is what it felt like. Everything I had spent years building, the arguments, the confidence, the certainty, the identity of being the man who knew better, it was simply gone. Not argued away, not defeated in debate, just no longer present, like it had been a coat I was wearing, and without any effort or decision, it had been removed, and now I was standing without it, and I could feel the difference. Then the voice, quiet, not loud, not arriving from any direction, not the kind of voice that exists in the air between things. It came from somewhere closer than that, something like inside me and outside me at the same time. Like the words were being spoken from the deepest part of me, and from somewhere much larger than me simultaneously. Just a few words, very few. You came looking for bread. I never stopped looking for you, that was all. My knees hit the floor. I did not plan it. I did not decide to kneel. One moment I was sitting at the table, and the next I was on the floor, and I did not feel myself move between those two positions. I was simply there, on my knees, with the picks trembling in both hands. My hands were shaking so much that I could feel the slight rattle of the lid against the container, but I did not drop it. Whatever was happening in my hands, they did not let go. The tears came before I understood what my body was doing. Silent. Not the kind of crying that comes with gasping or sounds. Just tears moving down my face, one after another, like something that had been stored for a very long time had found the door finally open. I cried the way a person cries when they have been holding something for so long that they have stopped noticing the weight of it, and then suddenly the weight is gone, and the relief of it is indistinguishable from grief. For the first time in as long as I could remember, there was nothing to argue. Not because I had been defeated, not because someone had found a flaw in my logic, but because argument itself felt suddenly like the wrong tool for the moment I was in, like trying to measure something with the wrong instrument. I had brought arguments to a place where only presence existed, and in the presence of what was in that room my arguments were simply irrelevant. I could not produce a single one, only tears. Only my trembling hands around a small silver container that somehow had not fallen. Then the weight lifted slowly, the way it had come. The silence returned to what it had been before, the ordinary silence of an apartment at night. The room became just a room again. The lamp, the window, my own hands. I was alone again. I stayed on the floor for almost a full hour. I did not speak. I did not pray with any words I could have written down. I was not thinking in sentences or making decisions or trying to understand what had just happened. I was simply there, kneeling, while the apartment sat around me exactly as it had always been. The lamp in the corner, the window with the street outside, my books on the shelf, my furniture unmoved, everything I owned exactly where I had left it before I had reached across the table and opened a small silver container. And yet, everything felt different. I cannot explain this accurately. Nothing in the room had changed. The physical objects were all where they were, but the room itself felt different, like a space that had been added to without anything being placed inside it. Like something was present now that had not been present before, not visibly, not tangibly, but undeniably. When thought finally came back, it came quietly. And my first thought was not what I expected. It was not, I was wrong about everything. It was not, I need to find a church or a priest. It was simple and specific, and I said it aloud to the empty apartment in a voice I did not quite recognize as my own. Why would he still come after me? After every communion line? After every joke on the sidewalk outside the church? After every lecture where I had stood in front of students and taken apart their faith piece by piece and handed it back to them in pieces. After every article, after every argument, after every moment I had treated something holy as though it was merely an object to be debunked. Why would he still come after me? I did not have an answer. I still do not have a full answer for that. The next morning I woke before my alarm. I sat at my kitchen table and I opened my email and I wrote to everyone I was scheduled to teach, and I cancelled everything for the next 2 weeks. I did not give a reason. I could not have given a reason in words that would have made sense to anyone. I just needed time that was not already organized into arguments. The Pix was on the table beside me. I did not understand why I kept it. It was a small empty silver container. There was no logical reason to keep it. Every time I thought about putting it somewhere permanent, giving it to someone, leaving it at a church, something in me simply would not do it. It stayed, and I let it stay. Years passed after that night. Real years. Enough of them that I can see the shape of what happened even if I cannot fully explain why. My life became quieter. That is the truest word for it. Quieter. The loudness, the debates, the public arguing, the careful sharpening of arguments against things other people believed, all of that simply fell away. Not all at once, but steadily. I stopped seeking platforms. I stopped accepting invitations to speak at events where I would be the person dismantling someone else's faith. The appetite for it was gone. In its place, there was simply a quietness that I had not had before. I began spending my time differently. I looked for ways to be useful that did not require anyone to know I was being useful. Small things, practical help offered to people who needed it and could not pay for it. I did this without announcing it or building a story around it. It was just what felt right to do with the hours I had that were no longer filled with arguments. Eventually, in one of those quiet places of service, I met the elderly man. He did not recognize me. He had no reason to. He had no idea who I was or what I had done. To him, every mass, every careful opening and closing of that Pix, every slow walk between the pews, had been its own act of service, one moment in a lifetime of such moments. He was a man who had spent decades doing one small thing faithfully, and had no idea what his faithfulness had looked like from the outside. We became friends the way people become friends when they keep showing up in the same place for unrelated reasons, slowly, over meals, over the kind of unhurried conversations that happen when neither person is trying to get anywhere quickly. I never told him who I once was. I still have not. I do not know if I will. And still, after all the years, the regret is there. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters to say it. I carry genuine regret about those communion lines. Not embarrassment that fades when no one is watching, not the mild discomfort of a mistake you can eventually laugh about. Real regret, the kind that has weight, the kind that does not dissolve completely no matter how much time passes. I think about the woman who smiled at me in the pew, the wide, warm smile she gave me because she thought I was someone sharing something with her that she loved, and I was standing there accepting her gladness under false pretenses. That matters. The people around me in those communion lines were doing something that meant everything to them, and I was there treating it like a stage on which to perform a proof. That is something I am not able to undo. The regret does not destroy me, but it never completely leaves either. It lives at a low level, like something that will always be present in the room even when you are not looking directly at it. The silver Pyx rests now in a small wooden drawer in my home. I do not have it on display. I do not bring it out to show people. Most days I do not open the drawer at all. It is simply there, in its drawer, the way certain things in a life are simply there, present without being prominently placed. But sometimes I open the drawer, and I take the Pix out and hold it in my hand, small and worn and heavier than it looks, the cross still faintly visible on the lid, the edges smooth under my thumb. And I go back. Not to the pain of it, not to the argument, back to the silence that changed its quality in the middle of an ordinary night in an ordinary apartment, the weight that filled the room, the voice that was quiet and specific and said so little and meant everything. I go back to the floor of my own apartment with nothing left to argue, and somehow, of all the places I have been in my life, that is the one where I feel most clear. This is where we started, the same wooden table, the same grey-blue of the morning before the sun arrives. The same small silver pyx resting in my palm. I have been sitting here for several minutes, and my thumb has been moving across the cross on the lid without me deciding to move it, the way it always does now when I hold this. I look down at it more carefully this morning. There is a small scratch I do not remember seeing before. It is near the engraved cross, not through it, just beside it. A single fine line in the silver, the kind that comes from years of being carried and handled and set down on surfaces, from a life spent in pockets and bags and drawers, from being opened and closed 1,000 times in churches and hallways and quiet rooms. I do not remember this scratch. Maybe I have seen it 100 times and simply did not pay attention. Maybe it is new. Maybe it has always been there, and this morning's light is just falling differently. I bring my thumb to it slowly. I trace it once, then again. The silver is cool and smooth under my thumb everywhere, except that one small line where the surface was opened up just slightly by whatever pressed against it. I hold the pyx in the morning light. I do not explain what the scratch means. I do not need to. Some things do not need to be explained. They just need to be seen. And I see it now. This small, worn silver container that I once walked past in a church without a second thought, that I once swallowed something from without the faintest care for what I was doing. That appeared in my office and my drawer and my travel bag, and eventually on the table beside me on the night I finally ran out of arguments. It was there for all of it. Every single step. Every church. Every mocking laugh outside on the sidewalk. Every joke on the drive home. Every moment I was so certain I was right, and the moment I was not certain anymore. And after, it was there for all of it, and it is here now. That is enough. If you stayed through this whole story, thank you. I mean that simply. Not as something you say at the end of a video because you are supposed to say something at the end of a video. I mean, I am genuinely grateful that you were here for it. Because this is not a story I tell easily or often. There is still something it costs me to put it into words. To say out loud the things I did. To describe the person I was and what I treated as nothing that was something to people who loved it. But I believe stories like this need to exist somewhere. Stories that do not wrap up perfectly. That do not end with every question answered and every wound healed and everything explained in a way that makes comfortable sense. That end instead with a person sitting at a table in the early morning holding something small in his hand, still not entirely certain how to explain any of it, tracing a scratch he is not sure he has ever noticed before. Those stories are true, and true things matter. Even when they are uncomfortable, especially when they are uncomfortable. If something in this story reached you, if it touched something you have been carrying, or made you look at something in your own life differently, there are more stories like this here on this channel. Not all of them are mine, but all of them are real. You can see them on the screen right now. Stay with us. Subscribe if you have not yet. Not because we need the number, but because I think there might be something here that you need. And if there is, that is reason enough to stay.